Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I wanted to do this last August, but ended up having to have some footwork done.
Fancy footwork?
Fancy footwork.
Since my summons.
And I'm doing much better, and so wanted to take some time. Actually, was able to do a couple of different things, and so I'll do a presentation tonight, and then I'll do another presentation on July the 15th. But tonight I kind of want to take you on a journey of the places that we visited last summer where the Holocaust unfolded. And these are not just places from history books. They are real towns with real forests, real buildings, where ordinary people once lived, once worshiped, laughed, and ultimately perished. What I want to share with you tonight is not only about what happened, but how I experienced those places and what they still have to say to us today. So this is the synagogue in the city in northeast Poland called Tykocin. And this building was built in 1642. Now, it's a big building, but imagine a building this big being built in 1642. Why would you need a building that big? Because you had a community of worshipers that was that big. This was built 100 years before the Catholic Church was built in Tykocin. And it still stands today. It stood all during the Second World War and afterwards. An interesting archaeological fact is that the local farmers used it to store fertilizer as a fertilizer warehouse after the war. And the fumes from the fertilizer took some of the paint off the wall and revealed, well, some really cool things. This massive stone building was the beating heart of the Jewish community for centuries. And inside, on the east wall of the building, you have this huge Torah ark out of carved stone. And then all around the inside, you have these prayers taking up an entire wall. And the reason is that so you didn't have to have, in the 1600s and the 1700s, having that many hymnals, that many prayer books that you would need would be just outrageous, right? So you put your prayers on the walls so that people could just turn around the room to the various prayers and say them with the rabbi. These Hebrew inscriptions are all around the inside of this huge room, and are sacred reminders of the folks that once worshiped there. By 1886, a year after the American Civil War ended, Jewish and Catholic families in Tykocin were so integrated that they established and built a joint elementary school, which was a rare thing in Eastern Europe at that time. Imagine being so integrated that you go in with your Catholic neighbors and you build an elementary school for all of your children. I was fascinated by the fact that all during Poland's early history, Jewish people figured very prominently in Poland was ruled by a king, and Jewish people figured very prominently in the various kings' administrations in Polish history. And so Tykocin ends up being a village that's right along a northern trade route from the steppes into Europe. And so there was a huge community of folks there that were involved in making sure that raw materials got from Eastern Europe through to Western Europe. By 1938, About 1,400 Jews lived in Tikachine, nearly half of the town's population. Most lived around the synagogue and the Jewish market that was at the west of town. This building, well, you see the Catholic church is down here at this end. That big building with the towers out in front of it. And at the far end is where the Jewish synagogue is. Most folks lived around the synagogue and the Jewish market that was on the west end of town. And then came the war. The Germans invaded Poland, but they had an agreement with the Russians that they had a non-aggression pact with the Russians, and so they agreed to go only so far and then stop. And Białystok, you see up in the upper corner you have Wilno, upper right-hand corner, and then you have Białystok, and then just across that red line you have Tikachine. And so this is as far as the Germans went, and then they backed off a little bit to, and so they invaded Tikachine the first time, and then they backed out of it because it was over the Russian line that they'd agreed upon. And so the Russians then had control of Tikachine for the next year and a half or so. 21 months later, actually, when the Germans then began Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Russian homeland, taking Tikachine back over again. Throughout Poland, the Nazis encouraged Polish citizens who were not Jews to go and take whatever their Jewish neighbors had almost immediately. This was in June of 1941. So this is the other end of town. The synagogue is over on the right-hand corner, or the right-hand side of the picture. You can see that large building with the tower there, and then there's an administrative building in front of it. This large open space to the left is the market. This was the Jewish market. And so 2 months after June, in August 25th and 26th, the SS ordered a resettlement of the Jewish population of Tikachine. And so everybody was ordered on the 24th, all the Jews of the town were ordered to gather in the market square. Able-bodied men were packed into trucks and told that they were going for labor. This is going to be a common reoccurring theme. People being loaded into something and being told that they were going to go to do something. The elderly, the women, the children were forced to walk 6 kilometers to a pine forest near, and my Polish pronunciation is not great, but it's Łopochowa. There was a forest there, and there some of the locals had been conscripted by the Nazis to dig pits. And when they got there, all the men who had been separated from everyone else, because the men would have resisted, right, if they'd figured out what was going on, were already in the pits, and their families were marched up to the edge of the pits, and they were shot. There are 3 large fenced-in areas where the pits were in this forest. Around 1,400 people were murdered over 2 days. And this was in the summer of 1941. Another 150 people were deported to Białystok. There was a ghetto there. And so these are folks that they rounded up after they had already killed these folks in the woods. They rounded up more folks afterwards, and they were later, when the ghetto at Białystok was eliminated, those folks were all taken to Treblinka and were murdered there. Only a handful of folks, Jewish folks, who lived in that village survived. And mainly they survived because they had been, these folks had been traders, and they had traded with farmers, and they had traded with folks that had small industry. And so those folks those Gentiles kept them. And they kept some of them until the end of the war. They kept some of them until they could get them to the Baltic Sea. I stood in this forest. I took this picture of the pine trees. And I have to tell you that as I walked among those pines in silence that had followed such horror, the wind, you know how it is when you're in a pine forest, you can hear the wind in the pine boughs. And I could not stop thinking that this sound, this wind in the pines, was probably the last thing that those folks heard. Radagast is not just the name of a wizard. Radagast train station is in Łódź. It's spelled L-O-D-Z, but it's pronounced Łódź. There's an actual engine, and then there are two battered cattle cars on display, actual cars that were used to transport folks from Łódź to a place called Helmo. This is the train station at Helmo, where the Jews from the Łódź ghetto arrived. There was a large mansion there. This is one of the only remaining pictures of the outside of the building. The folks would arrive by train to the Helmo train station. They would be taken by truck to this mansion. And at this mansion, they would be greeted by men in white coats that looked just like doctors, but they were SS officers. The whole thing was designed to keep people calm so that they had no idea what was about to happen to them. And it was explained to all of them as they arrived that they were going to be cleaned up, deloused, and transported to Germany to work in the factories. Deception is the key word throughout all of this. The whole time, the Germans wanted to keep people calm. And the goal, so at Helmo, it's where the Nazis first utilized these. This is a gas van from Helmo. There were 3 of them. 2 of them held 60 people, 1 of them held 120 people. And so after the people went down into the mansion, they were given paper bags, and they were given a numbered chit, and they put all their belongings in the paper bag, and they were given the numbered chit because they were for sure that they were going to be getting their goods back just as soon as they finished the showering and the delousing. And so down and they went, out into the vans they went, the doors were closed, the exhaust was redirected into the back of the vans. And they waited, and when the screaming stopped, they unhooked the exhaust, and then they drove out into the forest. These are some children at Helmo. They drove out into the forest where there's now a memorial, as you might imagine. And the Nazis were very efficient there. They dug pits beforehand. They figured out how many people they could murder in a day. They dug the pits beforehand. They put wood into the pits. They then brought the trucks out. They would unload the bodies into the pits, and they would immediately start a fire and, cremate everybody. If there was anybody that was still alive, then they were shot. And the goal of all this was to kill people more efficiently. In the forest, they had to use a lot of bullets for 1,400 people. This way, they could do it a lot more efficiently, and you might only have to use a few bullets because only 1 or 2 people may still be alive when you get to where you're going. And of course, the SS officers wanted to make it less distressing for German soldiers. Because if you, had to shoot people, it was, very hard. It conserved bullets that were needed on the Eastern Front. This is a huge field in the forest where pit after pit after pit after pit after pit after pit after pit are, and a memorial. It was real important for the Nazis to maintain order, to keep people calm. And that brings us to Auschwitz, and that brought us there on our journey because we started off where the Nazis were just shooting people, and then they were trying to gas people in trucks, and then they decided to try to figure out an even better way, and that brings us to Auschwitz. All over the world, Auschwitz has become a symbol of terror and genocide and the Holocaust. It didn't start off that way. It started off in 1940. The Germans wanted to establish a camp. The fact of the matter is that they had arrested all of the Polish intellectuals, all of the Polish newspaper editors, all of the Polish scholars, all of the Polish college professors, all of the Polish dissidents, and they didn't have any more Polish prisons to keep them in, and they needed someplace else to keep them. And so in 1940, they built Auschwitz in what was once a town. They shooed the residents away and then built a camp. And it was opened as a prison in June of 1940. And when you walk around it today, it looks like any inner city housing project. Big orange-red brick buildings with trees lining the streets, which is just the way the Nazis had it. They wanted there to be a sense of normality. It continued to function as a concentration work camp, and then it just grew bigger and bigger and bigger into the almost 40 miles surrounding Auschwitz. There was a tire manufacturer, there was a rubber manufacturer, there were all kinds of war materials manufacturing, and they needed the manpower and they used prisoners. So if you weren't immediately selected to be exterminated, to be gassed, to be murdered, you went into the workforce. There's some folks at Auschwitz. So on the left, you see the original camp, Auschwitz. You'll see up at the top on the left-hand side, you'll see Block 11. That's going to figure pretty prominently here in a minute. And then on the right-hand side, you see Auschwitz II, which later became known as Birkenau. The number of prisoners in the main camp of Auschwitz fluctuated between 15,000 and 20,000 people. Most of those folks were workers. And as the industry grew around the camp, they needed more people. So if you look at Birkenau and you look on all of those barracks, all those little lines, those are all barracks. They needed places for workers to stay. The greater part of the apparatus for mass extermination was built at Birkenau, and the majority of the folks were murdered at Birkenau. If you look up in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see two buildings on a road out there by themselves that look almost identical. And then if you look across the barracks over to the other side, you'll see two buildings that look almost identical. Those were the gas chambers and the crematorias. This is the entrance to Birkenau, probably the most famous picture you'll have seen. And you see that the Nazis then put a railroad line straight through the administrative building and straight into the camp. So this is crematory, gas chamber and crematory number 3. As I said, there were 4 of these. 2 were primarily, the mechanisms were primarily below ground, and 2, the last 2, 3 and 4, everything was built above ground because the Nazis were in a hurry. Didn't have time to excavate and do all of that. We're in a hurry here. We've got to get rid of these people. The first experiments with Zyklon B at Auschwitz took place in the basement of block number 11 that I showed you before on the map where block 11 was. Zyklon B was really inexpensive. All you had to do was expose it to air, and it would immediately start releasing its gas. So all you had to do was go in with a gas mask with a bunch of these little cans and open them up and place them around the room. Walk out and close the door. So the first experiments took place in August of 1941. The Nazis took 20 or 30 Soviet POWs, and they locked them in a small room in the basement of block number 11, and they put a few of these cans in there with them, and the test was successful. And a few days later, they tested again with 100 more POWs. This is the outside of block number 11. And this is the basement. So they tested on 100 more, and that worked. And so finally, on September 3rd, they did their largest test because they wanted to see just how many we could kill at one time. And so they put together a trial of 600 Soviet prisoners and 250 Polish political prisoners. And they crammed them into all 28 of the rooms in the basement. And they piled dirt against the basement windows on the outside so that nothing would leak out. And they dumped the Zyklon B pellets around. There were still some alive by morning. It was a lot of people in the basement. And so the Nazis added more gas, and by the following evening, they were all dead. Zyklon B releases cyanide when exposed to air. And it will cause you to convulse. It will dramatically decrease your blood pressure. It slows your heart rate, and ultimately respiratory failure. You almost drown to death. Later on, when the gas chambers became more crowded and efficient, death would typically take place within 5 to 20 minutes. The Nazis just got better and better and better at it. And this was the beginning of Auschwitz as a death camp. Block 11. Auschwitz had, the first camp had a small crematoria, 2 ovens. That's this photograph right here. You can just barely see it. It's a little bright. But there were 2 ovens, and they had platforms that come out from the oven with a push slide, and you rolled the body in, and you slid it into the oven, and you pulled it back, and you loaded the next body in, just like you were loading a shotgun. But it took a long time to cremate people that way. And they realized that that was going to be a problem. So they started building Birkenau. And like I said, they ran the train track right into the camp. And there was a platform and a station there. It looked like you were going to Aunt Franny's. When you got off of the platform, there were fellow Jews there to greet you, to help you get lined up. And when you looked through the fence, you deliberately saw women washing clothes, kids playing with balls, people looking like they were living a normal life. They wanted people not to be afraid, because literally minutes later, they would be in the gas chamber. In 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau became the largest killing center in Nazi-occupied Europe. Close to 1 million Jews, along with Roma, Sinti, Polish political prisoners, and Soviet POWs were murdered there. Birkenau was built to kill at scale. There were 4 massive gas chambers, each with its own crematorium that operated daily. Rail lines were extended directly into the camp to streamline the arrival of transports, and upon arrival, there was a selection process. SS doctors, those 4 gentlemen you see standing there, you have the men and the women separated, and you have 4 gentlemen standing there, and so they're going to point you here or there, just like that. The old, the sick, children, pregnant women, anyone unfit for labor, which included anyone wearing glasses, were sent directly to the gas chambers. If you lost your glasses, you might not be able to work. They weren't going to take a chance on you simply wearing glasses. So if you wore glasses, you were done. By the way, all of these gentlemen that you see standing at, these Nazis you see standing at the front of the line, all of those names are recorded. They know exactly who these people were. And but you can see this guy with his finger out, pointing there, pointing to the gas chamber. So that's the guy with the cane at the front of the line. Deception was central to keeping prisoners calm. Signs said showers, signs said delousing, signs said disinfection, and it was all so that people would cling to hope. One Auschwitz historian put it this way. He said, "Hope was the weapon of industrialized extermination." Give them hope, and they'll move right down the line. Those who were not immediately gassed were enslaved in satellite work camps, making war materials, working under the most brutal conditions, and most died within a couple of months. And the Nazis really didn't care. They wouldn't feed them anything. You might get bread at the end of the day. You might get cold coffee first thing in the morning. You might get water. But they didn't care. They would work people as long as they would survive, and when they died, they would put them in the crematorium, and then there was another trainload of people coming in the next day, and those people would be sorted and go right back into those jobs. There was no downtime. The Nazis were meticulous about documenting everything. Who arrived, who was murdered, how efficiently they were murdered. Records were kept for everything. This was genocide by administration. And it was only until the Red Army neared in 1945 that the SS began destroying the gas chambers and the crematoria to cover their tracks. We spent a full day at Auschwitz. If you go there and go to Auschwitz, you can take a tour, but the tour will last a couple of hours. We were very fortunate to have one of the premier historians who works there at the museum on the museum site. And it was a very, very long day. But you know, going back to that day in Tikachin, one day I'm sitting in this just beautiful synagogue where, and you can see the altar to the left, on the left wall, and just stunning building that has been completely restored to what it was like prior to World War II. So one day I'm sitting in there in a 400-year-old synagogue, a holy place where hundreds of people once prayed, and an hour later I am standing in a forest where they were murdered. And to me, the contrast was just staggering. This was the path out of the woods. It would have been the path that they walked in. Again, all of us, the group that we were in, there were about 20 of us, we all walked out in complete silence. There were just no words. That was really only the beginning of what we would see and witness while we were there. The museum has identified every person in this picture. You would think that they would not be able to do that after so many years, but they have identified every person and relative in this picture. January of this year, January 27th, 2025, marked 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. It has only been 80 years. When I began this journey, I wanted to understand how authoritarian regimes could descend into genocide, and how bureaucracies and borders become killing machines. But more than that, I also wanted to learn how individuals resist, how ordinary people find the courage to stand and against the tide. Some names are famous. You know them: Oskar Schindler, Irina Sendler, and others. But most who resisted in this way are unknown to us. There is actually a big book of the righteous among the Gentiles that lists every person that helped the Jews during the Holocaust. They felt it was important to remember their names too. But those folks who resisted sheltered children, smuggled bread and sausages, hid names, lied under torture. There was a Catholic priest at Auschwitz who refused to give up the names of folks and was murdered. Their courage should never be forgotten. These were all folks, ordinary folks, that would never have considered themselves heroes. But they did consider themselves humans. And we have to make sure that we care enough to act. The sheer size of Auschwitz and Birkenau, and the fact that it's still there. When you look at Birkenau, you'll notice that there are some barracks there, and every few years they get the foundations redone, and so that they can remain there as a permanent memorial. They get refurbished because weather, because they're more like barns, right? The wind, the rain, the cold. There would be two large platforms stacked on top of one another, and 10 or 12 people would sleep on one platform that you and I would think is about the size of a king-size bed, but it was a hard wooden platform. And then above that, there would be another one, and 10 or 12 people would sleep there. But the size of the camp, it's just incredible. So, I would ask you tonight, is there anything in particular that struck you? Or any questions that you have that you want to know more about? I'm not an expert, but I did spend some time with a couple of them. Yeah.
First of all, thank you. Excellent presentation. I wanted to say, I came in 2 minutes late, so I don't know if you said this. There were 3 million Jews living in Poland prior to World War II. 100,000 came home. And they came home to hostility. People saying Hitler should have killed you. And there were more pogroms even after they returned. So there's a lot going on there about the history of Jews and Catholics in Poland interacting with one another. And you made a really great point early on, how Jews have been prominent in Polish society in the administration of things. This is one of the most classic anti-Semitic moves that's ever been made, where the ruling class used the Jews to be the middlemen with the peasants. So the Jews would be the ones who collected the rent. The Jews would be the ones who were allowed, the only thing they were allowed to do was collect rent and be innkeepers. So the interactions between Jews and many Gentile peasants was about money. And so the Jews got this terrible reputation. They're the ones who control our money. They take our taxes, this, that, and the other. There was a lot of tension there that built up over many centuries and culminated in this horrible disaster.
3 million Jews in Poland before the war. It was the largest concentration of Jewish people in the world.
Correct.
The largest concentration. There were smaller groups in Hungary, but in Poland itself, it was a huge percentage of the population. And he's right. They were in administrative roles. And they were tradespeople, so they administrated trade back and forth between folks in the East and folks in the West. And they became affluent. And that was resented.
Well, I just want to say, many were affluent, you're absolutely right,
Yeah.
but the majority of Polish Jews were poor.
Right.
They were impoverished
Right.
because they weren't allowed to do much. So they lived marginal existences. But yes,
Yeah.
many were.
Right. But there were pockets of places like Tikachin where they were able to build a
Sure.
beautiful synagogue there. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes.
Excellent. This was really nice to see. My wife's grandmother was in Auschwitz, and she was in one of these small towns, like you mentioned, and her sister, her brother, and her smaller infant child, and her sister lived, they were a couple years apart, and her brother lived, and the parents and the small child were immediately killed. But she lived, she worked for the guards as a chef, and that's kind of what saved her. I think she was 12 or 13 years old when she went in. If you ever get to go to Israel, there's a phenomenal Holocaust museum called Yad Vashem, and On my side of the family, we don't know where anybody, they were in Poland and Russia, and a couple of them were able to make it out to the United States, and we have no idea where the rest of the world went looking. We got Hashem, we found some, but it's hard, a lot of people. So this was excellent, thank you.
Yes, Donna.
You showed pictures of the streets in Auschwitz today. Do regular families actually live there?
No. It's all a museum complex.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
I was trying to...
No, it looks, everything was designed to look nice, right? Keep people calm. Don't let them get concerned or worried or fearful. Plant trees down the street.
I was trying to imagine what it would be like to have Auschwitz as an address.
No, it's just, I mean, if you look at it, you think, well, this could be, if it didn't have barbed wire fences all around it, this could be any inner city tenement. And in July, if you want to hear more of this, come back. I'm going to talk about the last 10 months of Auschwitz-Birkenau and the push by the Germans to get rid of all of the Jews in Hungary and Budapest. You may not remember this, but Hungary was a part of the Axis powers. They were their own country. Germany did not invade Hungary. And so Hungary became a part and joined with the Germans to fight against the rest of the world. And so Hungary was able to keep, they adopted anti-Jewish laws like the Germans did. They just didn't enforce them like the Germans did. And the only particular reason that they did it was because they were very dependent upon the Jews of Budapest for the economy in Hungary. It was all about keeping their economy afloat. And they knew that if they allowed the Nazis to come in and eliminate that Hungary would very quickly fall economically. So it was purely, for the most part, economical reasons, but I'll talk more about that in July. But in particular, the Nazis' determination in the waning month, when it became apparent that they were losing the war. Somehow we get to the point where we don't see people as people anymore. We totally dehumanize people, and we do not see them as human beings. And when you don't see people as human beings and you only see them as vermin, I think our president even used that word in the last year. When you only see them as thugs, when you classify whole groups of people as, then it's really easy to start, for everybody, to pick up the cues and start dehumanizing other people. And then once you've dehumanized them, then they're cattle, right? You can haul them in cattle cars. You can put them to work in factories until they're absolutely useless and they die on the floor of the factory. And you scoop them up and take them away and you bring the next one in. How do we, Skip.
I'm loving this, Jeff. And, I'm searching my brain right now for the title of the book. I read this book several years ago, and it was about a Polish resistance fighter. And he was tasked with infiltrating Auschwitz. And everybody thought they'd never see him again. And he successfully did it. And it was to gather intelligence because it was just rumors what was going on there at the time. So he goes in, he comes back out with his intelligence report, and decides he can do it again, so he goes back in. And he builds an underground in Auschwitz to resist the Germans, to throw monkey wrenches into the works and slow things down. And it was, when I go home, I'll see if I can find the title of it, but it was a fascinating book. And he spent almost 2 years in Auschwitz and survived. He got numerous prisoners out.
His intelligence reports made it to London and initially were scoffed at.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Sorry to take them.
Oh, that's okay, no.
But a couple of really great books I want to recommend. One is by a woman named Lucy Davidowitz called The War Against the Jews. It's like, why did they do this insane waste of resources? They might have won the war had they not done this. The second thing I wanted to say is that, so The War Against the Jews. The other book is called The Abandonment of the Jews by a guy named David Wyman, I think, and it's all about, sadly, the inaction of the Roosevelt administration. So many cables were coming in, and Joe Kennedy, beloved as he may be to some of us, or some of you, was a rabid anti-Semite.
Yeah.
He threw him away. He was in London, he threw him away, and this was happening all over the place. The State Department was full of anti-Semites at the time. It was kind of fashionable to be an anti-Semite. They weren't happy that people would be murdered, but they didn't care really. So anyway, not great books, but they're very well written and they're very informative.
Yeah, thank you so much. Any other questions? Yes.
Did you happen to see structures like in the movie The Zone of Interest?
I'm sorry?
In the movie The Zone of Interest?
Yes.
Where the Gestapo was living these normal lives just on the other side of Auschwitz.
That house is still there.
Is it still there?
Somebody lives in that house.
That was one of the most frightening movies I've ever seen.
Zone of interest. It's, yeah.
People live just outside.
The commandant's house was just outside the walls. And his family played, they had parties, they had garden parties, and the whole time you can hear the noise of the German extermination machine.
And the smoke.
And the smoke. Yes.
Did they talk at all about the role of the Christian church in permitting, forming?
No. Here was the thing that really struck me when I was at Auschwitz-Birkenau, is that I was walking, I was lagging behind, as I normally do. I'm a slow walker. And I'm walking on this path, and I realized that the ashes of so many generations are right there in the dirt underneath my feet. I was just absolutely stunned. Yes, Mike?
One of your first few slides, you showed there was a saying over the gates.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the exact translation. Far Mount Christ.
Works makes freedom.
Work makes you free.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, because they wanted everybody to think that they were coming there to work, right?
Seeing the buildings looking so normal, it makes it clear that this normal facade was also to persuade the Germans who were not there that everything was fine. And that it was not only the victims, but when we see things and it's made so that it looks like everything's fine, that may not be the story.
Even so, they knew
Lulling the population into accepting it.
Yeah.
they couldn't do anything about it.
And again, the propaganda over the previous 20 years was that we're doing society a favor. We're doing the world a favor. They just don't know it yet. The Nazis believed, of course, that the Aryans were at the top of the list. The Slavs were the next group that were, you could use those as worker folks. And then the Jews were at the very bottom of the list. Go ahead, Skip.
Just out of curiosity, is there any information on what happened to some of the German soldiers post-World War II And I'm thinking the psychological burden that they must carry. You know, how did they handle that? How did they live with themselves? Because it's,
Most of them went to trial and were killed.
Yeah. Anybody that was associated with the camp.
That's not true.
Yeah.
Many of them went to trial, but I'd say most of them went.
They served time, right, or were not punished, they were let off.
But they weren't found.
Right,
They weren't found.
yeah. People that were notorious in the camps, some of those folks were found and tried. Some of them escaped.
more of like the ordinary.
The average,
soldiers.
these weren't average soldiers. These were SS soldiers. And SS soldiers were the true believers.
So they were totally brainwashed.
They were totally incomplete. And everything was, they did whatever they had to do to be upwardly mobile within the SS, right? Who can they impress? And how do you impress? You do the worst possible things to impress your, yeah.
My friend Leah and her family escaped the Nazis and went to Argentina and lived in fear her whole childhood because right on the street behind her lived these SS troops, these soldiers who
Had escaped Germany, yeah.
escaped Germany, lived in Argentina, and she was frightened her whole childhood because these guys got away with it and were living right behind her in Argentina.
Yeah. Well, I would love for you folks to come back in July. It'll be July the 15th. I'll be back here. And part of the reason is to tell you about what happened with the Jews in Budapest and Hungary, but also to tell you about one man who made a real difference. And he was no different than you and I. But he literally saved thousands and thousands. And his name is not a household name, but he made a huge difference. And I'd like to tell his story. So if you'll think about coming back in July, that would be great. One more question, Dave.
I can't help but relate to your initial comments on the cultural change that is planned, that takes place beforehand, and your initial comment about how it always starts with lies.
Yeah.
And it always starts with the acceptance of that as a part of the culture.
It is the slow erosion of truth until everybody believes the lie. And those who don't believe it are too afraid to speak up against it. So we have to guard ourselves. We have to protect ourselves against the slow erosion of truth. I'll leave you with that.
Thank you very much. Jeff, Mike.